So in the interest of getting started immediately on the questions, I'm going to give the government side the first question to ask, because I know they're all busy studying the questions that they have to answer. So if you will, gentlemen, pick the first question.
Rick, why don't you start? You look like you're ready.
Okay, I'll start here. When establishing or updating standards and specifications, NAVSE provides the opportunity for industry to comment. Have your companies participated, and do you see value in this process?
All right, I'll take that question. Is my microphone? Yep. There we go. First of all, I'd like to thank the panel for such short notice and coming down and presenting such, very, very good questions. Our company, do we participate in standards and specifications? We don't get asked too much on the standards side, but on specifications, we do participate quite a bit in reviews with NAVSE and with the shipyards. Over the past 5 years, we've been involved in reviewing product-centric specifications that relate to our products, for instance. Universal panel, the new control panel for air conditioning units on the ships. We had an extensive review at NAVSE on the specifications for that. The VPM submarines with electric boat, we review the specifications and development of those. The ORP, we find these actually very, very useful on the product-specific kind of reviews. Very, very, very useful for our company.
Any other industry comments? Then we'll take the first industry question.
Oh, would that be me?
It was mine, I guess.
Go.
All right, and we've actually heard a lot about this question, I think, throughout the day, but nonetheless, due to the enormous budget pressures that the Navy, Coast Guard are experiencing, is the requirement for U.S. manufacturing content for suppliers like our company going to be challenged on platforms like carriers, submarines, LPD, LHA, and destroyers? Some ships in the platform, like the LCS, Coast Guard vessels, have already somewhat disregarded the U.S. content for the lowest possible cost, because all that really has to be domestic is the shipyard itself, and they pretty much got their 50% content.
I'll jump in from the Coast Guard side, and that's absolutely right. We don't have that content requirement. They're Jones Act ships, so they have to be built in a U.S. yard. But affordability is extremely important to us, and we don't want to unduly constrain industry initiative and being able to find the best price and to compete suppliers for the best products wherever they may be found. They may be U.S., it may be foreign. A lot of our content on our ships right now is foreign content because that's where the best prices may be found. So we like to leave that as open as possible as we drive to the best price in acquisitions.
I would follow up. It's also not just about the cost. It's about meeting the requirements. When a component is looked at by the shipbuilder or in the sense of the Coast Guard, if there's a decision point on a particular item or any of the services, will it do the job? Will it meet the mission? And so what does that mean for industry? I would say that one of the things that's important is to be able to understand what those requirements are from the government, and then take a look at the portfolio of products and systems that are in the inventory with a particular company, and see if there are things that you can make the particular item more attractive in the sense of it meeting the requirements of the government. And I've seen companies that have done exactly that. They've made some investments in testing and proofing that the item actually meets the requirements, and therefore making it certainly a competitive choice for whether it's the shipbuilder or it's the Coast Guard that makes the purchase.
I was going to add the comment that as we go forward on some of these highly complex surface combatants, and we're seeing combat systems and whole mechanical electrical systems being joined closer together because of the nature of higher power weapon systems, that you get into the ITAR world very quickly. So this should be an advantage to some degree for the U.S. companies that can create ITAR-restricted components and then participate in a system, even though it may be HM&E, that really is part of a larger weapon system. So that should be a future advantage.
I'll chime in on a couple of fronts. I like the combat systems thought. I don't know, I'm not as familiar with the HM&E stuff. My anticipation would be as the SCADA systems become more linked, there might be some enthusiasm to stay strictly inside the U.S. for the underlying processor business and the networks for the surety there. IT systems, I think we're going to go down that same path eventually to stay inside. And it doesn't have to do with competition, or it just has to do with the surety of the supply chain and the processing ability. Combat systems might be a little bit different in the sense that from time to time, for whether it's a political reason or an economic reason, we look for capability that may exist outside the country. So there are companies that are challenged sometimes to say, why are you buying offshore for an actual weapon? And that has an awful lot to do sometimes with expediency in the case of a threat. So those are give and take. There's big companies try to always match the top of that. I had a thought about something else, but it slipped through my head for a second.
Just to give you a little more background to the question, we're a very much a domestic manufacturer when it comes to our Navy defense side, and we've done everything we can to stay as competitive as possible. But from a commercial standpoint, I own 2 facilities outside of the United States, and I have resisted moving product from that facility in the United States to our facilities in the other countries because I want this business to maintain domestic jobs. And I firmly believe, as a citizen of the United States, that it is not in the best interest of this country to buy parts from areas that might be in conflict at some point in the future when those vessels are being maintained or need to be replaced. At the same time, we have the capability to do that, and we've been resisting, and I believe, based on the comments I'm hearing, that I'm going to lose that battle unless I move towards my foreign operations.
One of the things, there's 2 sides to that in my view. One is if the system component that you're building, that your company provides, is a critical element in a combat path, is actual crucially important and unique to our ability as a nation and a capability, then I think more and more we'll think about keeping that internally and the surety of the supply chain that goes with that. From a competitive point of view, if you're manufacturing something that is widely used, available, and think of it as a pump or whatever you want to, then competitively on price going offshore in a lot of industries is the way to keep your price in order. And those are competing things that I think you have to worry about.
It does keep the price in check on that boat, I would agree with you, but in total, when all of us start moving it offshore, when we lose all the jobs that were created to supply the products in the first place, it gets difficult, and the costs rise.
Yeah, it begs the question sometimes on a barter basis from a purely largely the economic position of the United States. You know, what do you keep inside? What do you keep outside? And industries go and come as advantage attributes to them.
The other follow-up comment I make is that, you know, one of the other requirements is the ability to maintain and support the item after the initial acquisition. Yep. And I think that is something, having done support overseas and trying to get some of that becomes very challenging depending on the particular company or system. I got to think that's an advantage. And if we who buy things for the federal government, if they think about long-term affordability and life cycle cost, I think there's a business case to be made by domestic manufacturers for providing that high-quality, responsive support that is very valuable to the government. And maybe that hasn't been championed enough, hasn't been talked about enough, but I tell you, as both Navy, Coast Guard, anyone that buys anything for the government, you got to be thinking about the cost of ownership and the responsiveness and the ability to get things fixed quickly. There is a domestic advantage in there, and you got to make that business case.
Thanks, Steve.
I just want to add, Steve, your particular company deals with kind of an important component, the chillers, you know, the air conditioning.
Yes, yes.
Right, and the, in that particular case, it's now become really part of the weapons system. But if you are totally offshore, for instance, we can't share the design drawings with you to help you more fully integrate what your capability is with the weapons system. So I think that's very critical for the U.S. to maintain that ability in the U.S., especially with something dealing with cooling, which is huge.
Absolutely, absolutely right. The cooling requirements on a naval combatant ship, the majority of the cooling requirements are not driven by the people, it's really the electronics. The radar probably being the biggest single one of those. So if the air conditioning goes down, the electronics overheat, the radar goes down, the ship is blind. It's a really bad situation. But back to the point of offshoring, as a U.S. taxpayer, you would like to think that your tax dollars are spent in America. It's conflicting goals. It's really a tough one. It's a real tough one.
If you listen to the folks that are in the press, there's two objectives. One is spend it in America because that's our dollars. The second is find it at the least cost you can get it at, which is counter to the first part. So
yeah, as a taxpayer, I want the government to spend my money efficiently, but I also would like to see them spend it here in America, and it's just competing interests. It's very
let's
difficult.
figure out how to do both.
So follow-up question, is there a process that the government is looking at to try to strike a balance between those and identify what areas of the industrial base are important to maintain in the U.S. versus what are readily available perhaps in many places offshore so that there's relative certainty of supply even in times of conflict, that we're not buying from the bad guys?
I don't, and maybe others will comment. I've got my only response to that is kind of what Secretary Kendall talked about this morning. At a very high level, the question of fundamental defense industries and what's important to maintain. I'm not sure it gets down to the component level. I do know there is some conversations in the IT world that revolve around a number of things. Security drives that one in some sense. In the big manufacturing industries, they're at the OSD level and certainly in the Navy for shipbuilding, trying to figure out what's really crucial. And that you can only focus on a couple of big things that if they went away, the whole, you don't build ships anymore. So I'm confident there's levels at which we have that discussion. I don't know that it drives down to particular component parts. I just don't have the information there. So
I guess at the highest level, it comes down to what's the U.S. industrial policy. And that's unfortunately above our pay grade. The FAR says we got to get the best price, excuse me. And so that's what we do in the acquisitions world. The industrial base is important. In the Coast Guard, we tend to follow the Navy through their industrial base. They build it and we benefit from it. We like to support it where we can, but that's not an overwhelming necessity for us. We're trying to get the affordable products. And our technology content typically is down on the lower scale. Where we do have the weapon systems, we're getting them from the Navy, is Navy type, Navy owned. So we're just kind of piggybacking their existing programs of record.
I guess I'll rethink for a second. I do know that there are some component pieces of important weapon systems which are unique and only built in the U.S. industry, and they are of a worry at certain levels where there's only one supplier. And so how do I keep that supplier in business, not just from a life cycle point of view, but he's the only supplier, and so am I willing to pay a premium? And identifying which of those pieces is truly crucial is part of what program managers do, and bring that forward and say, there's only one supplier left that does this. Now, those are rare. They're bits and pieces, but there is that conversation that goes on.
I was just going to tell Richard, about a year and a half ago, I happened to talk to the CNO, and he was dealing with suppliers for shipbuilding, and he says, you know what really worries me, and this ought to interest you, is I'm worried about valve manufacturers that are critical to my ships that suddenly go out of business. So you got interest from the highest level of the Navy on this.
That's good to hear. and not just selfishly, but but as any manufacturer who's invested because these are very capital-intensive businesses, just like shipbuilding is. When you invest like that, and you're looking out 5 and 10 years, because if you don't look out at least 5, you're only going to get one carrier anyway, and you got to look out at least 5 or 10. And then when the system seems to be relaxing, when I see the warfare ships being bid at yards that have not been traditional shipbuilders and with standards that are going to be more like the Coast Guard, it really gives me cause for concern with that investment that we made years ago to support it down the road.
Yeah,
And
that's actually a good
Let's go on to the next
discussion.
question.
Yeah, okay.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Over to you guys.
I'll put an easy one, or at least one that should generate some response. What is the biggest government-created obstacle to their success as a business?
I'll start that response. One of the interesting obstacles that we have is the issue of intellectual property rights and who owns them. And over the years, the pendulum typically swings back and forth between the government wanting all rights and to the government allowing suppliers to maintain the rights. And it's often a bit of a dilemma for suppliers to make a decision as to how much of their know-how and their ideas they want to contribute early in the stage of an acquisition, for fear that in the course of discussion, when that know-how gets out, now gets written into the spec, and the competitive advantage that they might have is lost. So clearly competition is a good way to drive costs down, and as a supplier, we want to maintain our competitive edge. So the obstacle is how much should we reveal, understanding that then it goes into the public domain, versus how much should we withhold, which then only gets used if we succeed in winning the competition.
Well, I'll start the conversation, because I had to deal with this in a couple of weapon systems we dealt with. The approach, I think sometimes this is a misunderstood topic. There's flexibility here. At one end of it, you've got the question of, in the life cycle, should you go out of business, how do I maintain the system? So there's an interest on the part of the government that says, I need to somehow know what you did, because I might have to recreate it or maintain it. Or you might move on to a different business. And there's ways to handle that. You can put IP in escrow. You could do a lot of different things that allow that. I don't think there's any intent on the government part to inadvertently or deliberately reveal your competitive edge. And that should worry you. It does in my own industry. And so this is one of those areas where I think a negotiation, a conversation, a debate about the goodness, what you need, what I need, really ought to take place. There never ought to be a straight line that just says, I got to have it all. And I think sometimes there's this misunderstanding on the government part that says, I just got to have it all. And we got to fight that one down and say, what do you really need it for? And if it's the life cycle, got it, and we can make arrangements. If it's the intent to reuse in other government industry, well, how do I protect it so that a competitor doesn't have it, although you're going to build it internally? And those are good debates to have. I don't think there's a straight line here.
I'd like to actually ask Christine her view on this. You're close to, of course, NAVSES Philly over there. Are you concerned from an industry point of view that the government might actually compete with you?
I can't tell you how much I appreciate you asking that question, actually. I think, yes. I mean, obviously, that is something where I see probably the biggest conflict here is in the area of depot and repair facilities, for example. So one of my questions to you gentlemen was, there's a big push, and actually depot repair and overhaul work has become a big part of some of our businesses. A lot of investment and a lot of pride that goes into knowing the OEM is repairing our own equipment because our name is on it. However, I think at times we are, as an industry, frustrated while we understand the Navy has an obligation and shipyards and repair facilities are there for a reason, but maybe in the future there's a way we can share the workload. And what's concerning to me is the level of standards that are being followed, and certainly in a critical time, I understand that. But I think there's a lot of training perhaps that needs to take place at some of these facilities. We've seen the fact that, what's probably most frustrating is we're not getting feedback. So we can walk into any of these repair facilities and it's like, our West Coast facility. But some of the problems that are coming out, or that we're finding out, it would really be nice to know that, sooner rather than later, and hearing it from some of the repair facilities. And the other last point I want to make, some of the practices I do worry about sometimes, whether it's the quality of parts or the plating requirements that need to take place versus a standard off-the-shelf box of hardware. And we see a lot of this that comes through. So it's a concern, and I think I'd like to see maybe something that we can work out where we can maybe share the load or be able to train. So that's something I would definitely be interested in. Thank you, Rick, for asking that question.
I would offer that it's an understanding of what the role of government is and what the role of industry, OEM, suppliers, the labor force managed by commercial enterprise. And from the government perspective, it's very risky to create a turnkey relationship where all knowledge, and this is a question about knowledge and understanding and allowing the government to be able to make a good decision, to be outside of the government lifelines. And so there's certainly some need to retain some capacity in terms of emergency and those kinds of things. But I got to think that industry has the ability to efficiently deliver support, services, training, the whole piece in a context of where the government has some piece of that to be able to be a smart buyer of those services. Because if you completely outsource out of the government, you can get into a situation where you're not even smart enough to know which contractor to go to because you don't understand the business that's involved. And so I think there's a happy hybrid there of some organic capability within the government that leverages some of the efficiencies that are only really possible out in industry in terms of providing some of those support and services. And I think that's where you have those conversations. It's the government's obligation also to create some contract vehicles where industry can compete to provide those services that we know that they're probably going to be more efficient on in certain areas. But also industry has to respect that the government has to maintain some organic capability to be able to make good decisions about what kind of support they need and what level of capacity is required. And I think that's an ongoing effort, and I think industry has an obligation also to offer what they can do and how they can do it cost effectively and provide that support to the government, and at the same time the government to understand there is a role for industry to provide exactly that kind of efficiency.
Thank you, appreciate that.
There's a perspective here, I think, where we can both help each other. And you think about the large depots, aviation depots, and I'm not thinking about shipyards necessarily, but production line depots. And I'd like to see an opportunity develop where the investment can be shared between industry and government to go put capability in those depots where there's some opportunity for you to gain work share. And then on the government guys to keep the training and the expertise. And that could even go down to the IMAs and so on. But there has to be a shared investment. I think that would work to both our benefits. It trains the sailor. That's important to train the sailor and get it right. You have great processes. We need to learn from that, and that mechanism doesn't exist. And of course, when you get to depots and things, there's the caucuses and work share and load and all that stuff starts to play on top of it. But if there was a way to work together to get that kind of permission and that kind of acceptance at the congressional and OSD levels, and said, let's go share in this investment. And you do it a little bit on a program. I'll put half in, you put half in, I'll give you there might be some way forward that's beneficial to both sides.
Well, considering Rick's brilliant segue to Christine's excellent question, that puts the next question back on the government side. So, Tony or Bruce, would you like to ask the next question?
Sure, I'll ask one. With all the obstacles and overhead and bureaucracy and politics that go on with the major defense contracting, I always wonder why you guys would want to be in this business. But every time you read an award in the Post or whatever, they always call them lucrative. You just won this lucrative government contract. And I look at all these problems inherent with government contracts. Why do they always call them lucrative? And why are you even in this market space?
I'll try that one there. That's a very tricky question. First of all, I think the term lucrative maybe has some negative connotations like fatness and stuff, and I really don't see that at all. These contracts are big in dollar values because Navy ships are expensive. That's the nature of the beast. In the world that I live in as a subcontractor, the vast majority of my contracts are all firm fixed price. On a firm fixed price contract, I can lose money. If things don't go as I estimate, I can and have lost money on contracts. Many times we're sole source. So complying with the TINA laws, we have to go open books. So we open our books, we show the government auditors, here's our estimate for materials, for labor, for overhead, for SG&A, and here's the profit margin I want to make, and we negotiate on that. But at the end of the day, they're firm fixed price, and I can definitely lose money on them. So I don't know where the connotation of lucrative, other than maybe just the sheer size of the dollar amounts bandied around. And many times people think, oh, it's cost plus, that's a license to print money. Well, no, it's not. Because when they ask you to develop a new air conditioner that you've never built before, they say, how much is it going to cost? I say, I don't know, I've never built something like that before. So if you want me to take the risk, then you price that really high, and if they do a cost plus, it's probably a better deal for the government. I don't know. My 2 cents worth.
I'd just comment here as, one of the difficulties if you're a mill standard house, I know, Bob, you've talked about this, that suddenly the government allows something non-mill standard. It's so cyclic on these, especially depending on the type of ship we're talking about, but a high-end surface combatant, maybe we drifted away for some time from a mill standard requirement, suddenly bounces back because the threat suddenly makes that mill standard, that shock vibe, environmentals, EMI, EMP requirements, suddenly that's got to be there. So it's sometimes the Navy reawakens to the need for the mill standard, and that's why we have industry partners that focus on mill standard products are so critical.
Yeah, many times that's when the financial folks in the Navy will say, well, why can't you take the commercial air conditioner that you put on a ferry and use it on a military ship? And we say, well, yeah, we can do that, but when you put 1,000 Marines on a ferry, it's not a ferry anymore, now it's a target. You need survivability.
One of the follow-ons to that question was, why are you even in this business to begin with? It's so difficult to deal with the government. And in some ways it is, but in another, you've made that investment. You can see, for the most part, that the trends are that ships are going to be built in this country. So you look down the road and you say, this is a sound investment. And as Steve said, not all of them wind up being as good an investment initially. But it's also, for most companies, a very big part of your domestic base. And which comes back to my first question. I don't want to delve into that so much as I do when you're looking down the road and that domestic base is interrupted by huge delays. If your business is entirely related to the defense industry, you're going to have a very difficult time staying in business. So most of us have businesses outside that are commercial related, and that's the balance, and that's why we can stay in both.
How important is that expertise in dealing with government in terms of businesses, your business's core competency, and what markets you want to compete in?
Yeah, I'll take this one. For us, it's huge, and as we look and we plan 3 to 5 years out, and we look at where we want to invest, we're focused on our core competencies. But we're also, as we had in our last panel discussion, constantly replanning and planning and things shifting and things moving. And how do we remain competitive is probably one of the biggest questions we have to ask ourselves a lot. But then you get into, do you really want to go into some other things? So from a culture perspective, you know, we live the life of shock-hardened and rough and tough, and we have our procedures for everything, and we have our quality standards. It's kind of hard to break that mold going from this rigid, you know, very process-oriented business to a commercial type of world where I'm not saying quality is the issue. It's, you know, the oversight, the documentation. It's very hard for us. It's very hard to do that, and it's hard for our employees to, you know, today I'm going to act for my military jobs, tomorrow I'm going to act. So it's a very fine line, and it's a very difficult one, and quite honestly, I think the way we've come about it is, you know, investing more in IRAD programs rather than looking for things outside of our niche. We've had some really good, successful programs, but we've also had some really bad programs. You know, a lot of lessons learned that we said, we'll never go into that area again. So for us, it's more, you know, how can we invest in our, make our core competencies better and make us more competitive, and keep looking for things in our arena.
Yeah, I'll add a bit to that. Different than my three colleagues here, my company's a systems integrator, so we're not a manufacturer of anything. We subcontract all our manufacturing, or we buy components and integrate them into a system. And we also participate both in commercial markets as well as the Navy markets. And so why are we in this business? Because we do understand how to satisfy a lot of the government requirements, and we find that's an opportunity for us as an integrator to do some matchmaking between lower cost commercial components and bringing them along with the various SROs and CDROs required to satisfy the Navy requirements. We're able to add value in that process. So I don't know that I would describe it as lucrative, unless lucrative means very risky and painful. I've got to check Webster's. But I don't think that's what it means, and I always have trouble when I see that in the press of where's the lucrative nature. Here it is. But it does provide us opportunities as, I guess, sort of a niche supplier to bridge this gap. And so that's why we're in the business.
Gary or Steve, would you like to ask the next question, please?
I'll give it a shot. We heard in some of the MMA discussions earlier reinforced that the submarine shipbuilding plan and the aircraft carrier shipbuilding plan are relatively stable, the debate over the current RCOH notwithstanding for the carrier. But in the rest of the surface ship market, there remains a fair amount of uncertainty in the government shipbuilding plan, and that can often discourage equipment suppliers and shipyards from making investments to lower the cost of those ships if they don't know when or what ships might be built. And lately it's perhaps more the when, not the what ships. There seems to be some stability in what ships are going to be built, but what year they might be funded, changes in acquisition strategy to you know, work to creatively drive costs down, create some uncertainty. The government does provide some support to industry in the form of cost reduction studies, but that doesn't take the place of the companies themselves investing in new product development and production infrastructure. What is the Navy and Coast Guard doing to help reduce that uncertainty in the shipbuilding plans, and how can government and industry maybe perhaps share risk of some investments that are targeted for reducing cost of future shipbuilding?
Yeah, first, you have our sympathies.
Thank you.
You know, that is a tough problem. I mean, and it's kind of back to my last question. Why do you want to be in this business? Because it's tough to run. I mean, to build a ship efficiently, it's basically got to be built like a factory. You know, Henry Ford figured this out 100 years ago, how to do this. We're only now getting to that point in our shipbuilding industry with grand block strategies and this and that, where it's becoming more efficient. And efficiency requires stability, predictability, which requires predictable and stable funding. You got to know how much you're going to need, when you're going to need it. You just can't turn. And I know sometimes we act like, well, just go get another 1,000 workers. And how come these new welders aren't as good as the old welders that you just laid off last week? You know, you can't run a company that way. We can't run the Coast Guard yard that way, but somehow we seem to expect commercial industry to be able to run their yards that way. I know we act that way, but we feel we feel your pain. Things that we're doing to try to help this along is we're not changing our requirements. We get the requirements out there, we get the contract out there, the RFP, and we manage our appetite. We take appetite suppression on requirements changes, because changes do not help you, and especially when we're in a fixed price contract, it's going to cost us. So that imposes discipline both on the government and on industry to stick with the product. So we try to maintain that, and we structure our acquisitions, especially our shipbuilding acquisitions, to try to have that steady state production run. With OPC, we went to industry and we said, what's the optimum production cycle? And it turned out to be 2 per year, where we could maximize competition and maximize the learning curve. So that's what we're going up with. We're building 1 a year for 3 years, then we go to 2 per year for the remainder. The whole idea is to try to drive down that production curve, because that'll show up, or that learning curve, that'll show up in the production cost, and that'll show up in the cost that we end up paying. So anything we can do to drive that helps. Block buys, multi-year procurement, anything that adds stability to the funding is going to help. There's some, that's a bigger political battle, but where we can get to steady state production, mature product baseline, and then get multi-year funding or block buy authority, we want to do that so we can give you that predictability and that certainty, because otherwise you have no incentive to invest in production efficiency if you're only building one ship. And we always like to throw out the NSC. We bought those one at a time, and each one was going to be the last one. So I wonder how many times will we paid to shut down the yard on the NSC program. Well, now we're doing it for number 8. We actually are doing it this time, but we've probably already paid that about 5 times. That's not a good, efficient stewardship of government funds. We should be able to set that up ahead of time and then run that whole production line, so you know what you've got ahead of you, and we know what we've got ahead of us.
I think from all of us, we want to say thank you for listening to us. I think that's the best thing that we could have possibly come up with for us and for you. So, thank you.
Thinking about what Secretary Kendall was talking about this morning, I think some of the answer, first off, write your congressman and your senator. That's what puts stability in, and you know that, and we know that. From a Navy point of view, what I hear is heartening if I think about it from the large perspective. They've picked the ship designs, and they've said shipbuilding is what we're going to protect above all. Somewhat disturbing to those people who are into the readiness business and the training business and those sorts of things. But if you have confidence that the leadership of the Navy isn't just a one-time thing, that this is about how we survive through the next decade and have a Navy when we come out of it, they've picked the ship designs, they've picked the ship hulls for good reasons and affordable reasons, said that's what we're going to go do and we're going to build those. So I think from one perspective, there's a bright spot here. You know exactly what we're going to do. Can you keep that enthusiasm for that exact plan for the next 10 years? I sure hope so, because it'll help all of us. But I think there's a bright spot amidst all of this flurry.
Yeah, I agree.
One idea when you're looking at investments is to take advantage of the R&D money that I know you're familiar with, but sometimes not taken fully advantage of. As Secretary Kendall and I think Secretary Stackley mentioned, they do put money and they're trying to fence the R&D money. And the R&D community, you think of DARPA and ONR specifically, their responsibility is transition whatever they come up with actually into a ship. And what they're looking for is teaming with companies to respond to their opportunities. But you also think of NSRP and the SBIR and Mantech. And I think companies, don't take advantage of the NSRP, for instance, as much as they could. It's mostly, they think of it as a shipyard thing and not a company thing, and I think there are opportunities for industry.
Tony, next question is yours to ask.
Thanks, Joe. And I'm going to go a little bit off script. You don't have this question. If
I suppose that's only fair.
Yeah, yeah.
Like you're a
So-
surprise guest.
Yeah. But we can do this. Joe and I grew up together as roommates trying to be EAs together at the same time. If sequestration returns and has its 10-year plan, what are you going to do with your companies? Where are you going to go? How are you going to accommodate that in your business plan? Given you want to grow, you want to sustain, what markets do you go to? And I'd like to hear from each one of you. What are you going to do?
Let me start with that one. That's a good one, and something we all kind of think about in the back of our minds with a fear. That would be tough. We would have to, perhaps maybe to keep our factory fed, look to maybe some foreign navies to keep our business going and keep it viable, which, you know, I'd hate it to go that way, but that's what we would have to do to stay alive.
Thank you.
I think from our perspective, we'd look at it in two ways. One is knowing that the number of ships will probably be reduced, they'll still be built. We'd try and leverage our expertise in the industry to find more products per ship to expand with the capacities that we'll have available to get on more products. And secondly, our commercial side of the businesses, we would be investing heavily in new markets there. For us, commercial construction is big, and we would continue to do more of that.
Thank you.
I think from our perspective, we are sole source in a lot of things, but that's not stopping us for seeing how to grow the business in the future. One of the things we're doing as well is the international markets. So more and more, we are getting into more products, into more of those markets overseas. I think the other thing too is just, you know, as best we can and planning the workload. A lot of what we've done with our customers may stretch over 2 years, or I think the biggest thing for everyone in this instance is how are you going to maintain your costs? You know, we go in with these programs with set overhead rates, and you know, we're certainly not going to play the victim here, so it's up to us to figure out how we're going to maintain those overhead costs and so on and so forth. So,
Thank you.
For us, it's a bit different than the others. It's really a continuation of a strategy, and how can we find other ways to support shipyards and expand the services and capabilities that we have to help drive the ship costs down. So while sequestration, I'm sure, would have an impact, it doesn't necessarily affect our base strategy, which is look for ways to drive cost out and how can we become more efficient in the shipbuilding process.
Sure. Thank you. Insightful. Appreciate it.
Steve, questions to you.
All right. When the Navy and the Coast Guard make decisions on insourcing or outsourcing certain services, like let's take maintenance, for instance, maintenance of capital pieces on your ships, the electric generators or the gas turbines or even the AC plants. What's the thought process in evaluating, should I have the sailors or should I maintain that in-house or should I go to the OEMs to maintain that?
Yeah, in theory, if we could contract out everything, we would. But like Ron said earlier, we've got to be smart enough to be a smart buyer. So there's a certain infrastructure that we've got to maintain. We also, once the ships are away from the pier, we've got to have the expertise to be able to manage casualties underway. And so there's a minimum amount that we've got to do. We always try to look at doing just the minimum. We're in the business of operating ships, not building ships. And if we could get away from maintaining ships, we do that too, but we just can't do it completely. So we'd like to contract out as much as possible, but we got to retain enough of it to be a smart buyer, to have the knowledge and the infrastructure and the base to be able to do it ourselves when we need to do that.
Right. The challenge that we've tried to get in on maintenance contracts in the past, and some we've been successful on. The biggest challenge seems to be is the Navy, the Coast Guard say exactly what you're saying. But when they make the financial evaluation, they can say, okay, to have it done outside, here's what's going to cost me. How much am I going to save internally if I don't do that? And that's the hard number to come up with, is how much do I save by not doing it? And that's what makes it's hard to make an evaluation.
Yeah, I'll just build on that, and I acknowledge that that's a challenge, but with the idea that retaining that kind of core competency in the sense of understanding exactly what you're getting and providing that emergency, or having your support system be able to be smart enough to choose a source. I've had, in my time, folks come in from industry, whether it be maintenance contracts or support contracts or even OEMs, who come in and say, hey, listen, I acknowledge those fundamental facts of what you've got to retain as core competency, but let me show you a business methodology here that I think might fit very well and still achieve what you want. What I get turned off is, in the past, is somebody comes in and says, I can do it all for you. Because when you do that, you right away have kind of lost the audience. And so coming in with a hybrid support system that says, here's the numbers, here's the business, I investigated how you do this, here's how I could save you some money but still be respectful of the government's requirement to keep some organic knowledge and capability and responsiveness in their into the system. And when that has occurred, my organization, the Coast Guard, absolutely jumped on some of those things. And some of the more innovative maintenance contracts have come about because the OEM or industry put those ideas in place, and some were competed outwards so that multiple people could compete for it. Some cases with the OEM, it was a new way to do business with the OEM. So that innovation in providing support, I think, is going to be critical to the future. And in constrained dollars, I think there's a real opportunity for industry to come in with some cost-efficient ways to do things, as long as you respect the government's responsibility to retain some organic capability to manage it.
Good point.
The Navy used to have a lot more intermediate maintenance activities than they do now, but with that kind of concept in mind, the three levels of maintenance, you have the organization, what the sailors do typically on a ship. The intermediate was you'd send those sailors to a shore activity or a tender, when we had a lot more, and train them at another level of maintenance than the depots, which could be either industry or a shipyard or a NADEP or something. So that there's government sunk costs in these depots, government sunk costs in sailors. But one thing we did years and years ago was we actually sent sailors, and they got certified to do maintenance on OEM equipment. And the nice thing is when these guys get out of the Navy, guys and gals get out of the Navy, guess who hires them? The OEMs, because then they become your tech reps. So it's a two-way process, and the sailors got super trained and gave them really a career, and they were valuable to both the Navy and to industry.
I might be somewhat jaundiced because I spent 3 years as a penance tour in OPNAV being a resource sponsor for maintenance and readiness, and so got, for lack of a better word, forced to be engaged with the Depot Caucus and that environment. So perhaps a different perspective. I do question, if you will, the military necessity to put many things inside of a depot, particularly when you're talking about big pieces of equipment, the LM-2500 decision and so on, or things. Those get driven for political reasons in a lot of cases, and there's constituencies to do that, and there are laws about 50% in the depots, and so, to comply with law, sometimes we have to go create the opportunity to do things in depots, and I'm speaking here of really big things. So there are some constraints that play into the decision process that we don't have control over. My own feeling is that there is great goodness in going back to what I suggested earlier, the opportunity for maybe doing work inside the depot, putting the fixtures in and so on, and sharing that workload. And in some cases that occurs, where it's government contractors side by side. I sort of hate to see just us doing it, and I do think you have a bone to pick with us sometimes on, are you my competition or are we partners in this? Because in some cases it is a competition in a depot for who's going to do it at lower cost, and we could share it, or it may not necessarily have to be extremely just on the government side. Those decisions back, not trying to absolve myself of responsibility, but sometimes your hands are tied about those kinds of decisions.
Next question from the government side.
I think I hit the last one right.
It doesn't have to be Rick. If one of the other panelists has a burning desire.
Is there anybody still?
Yeah, okay.
Somebody?
Here's actually a good one. Well, they're all good, sorry, Joe. But the
We're on the emergency generator.
question about the protests on award, I've seen it go a couple different ways. Like industry's perspective on this, when is it not smart to protest an award?
Okay. This one's a sort of a delicate question. None of us really want to protest orders, but there are times when, as a manufacturer, and for us, most of them are standard Navy products that we're manufacturing, so our people are very intimately involved in what's required, and sometimes we'll see a new rev come out, and the old numbers don't change, but the revs keep going up. So another competitor might be bidding on something, and we'll take exception to it because we recognize that you can't do it with the rev they're asking for, and yet we might lose the award because the other guy didn't understand, and we'll take the business, and in some of those cases, we have protests. We don't protest from price. Price is not a reason to protest. It's usually with the spec and the integrity of the product itself.
Yeah, I'll add, I don't think we've ever officially protested an award, but often for solicitation for spare parts for a system we may have provided as the original provider to the ship, we may not win all the spare parts awards, and when we lose, the good thing is we have some ability to go and research that a bit, understand who was the awardee, and do some research into the type of components that they're probably providing. It's not unusual for us to have a concern with that part that they're providing, because we can kind of trace back through the supply chain and confirm that it's actually not the same as the original equipment that was on the ship, and now there may be a configuration management problem, or worse, an operational problem. What we'll do then is we'll usually bring it to the attention of, whether it's MSC or Navy, bring it to the attention of the purchasing, the buyer for the government, as well as draw it to the attention of the engineering group within the community. That doesn't fix the immediate problem, although it alerts them to the potential for problem, and on occasion, it plays itself out, and then they come and purchase the correct part from us. It's not that there's an intent of any sort. They're buying based on price. It's just that sometimes the verification that the alternate part is compliant isn't as thorough as it sometimes could be. And so it's not really a protest, it's a supportive discussion, I'll say.
Who'd like to ask the next industry question? Rick, you were first up last round.
Sure. Is the Navy, this question has been bantered around for days. Is the Navy reaching a break point in operational efficiency due to the extraordinarily long missions Navy personnel and vessels are forced to work to manage the current world threats? And as a follow-up, even with extraordinarily long missions, how well is the country keeping up with missions necessary to protect America and its allies?
So I'll take it on simply. I've listened an awful lot to what the CNO says and what the Commandant says for the Marine Corps, and I can't do anything but expect that they know what they're talking about. The force is strained. From a personal perspective, there are long deployments, whether you're a Marine or you're a sailor. At some point, families start to ask for, why are you doing this? Why aren't you here with me? Our forces, whether you're a Marine or a sailor, are extraordinarily dedicated, and the strain they live with, we all lived with it when we were deployed, but it does drive people to ask the question sometimes, and you stay in for a lot of good patriotic reasons, and sometimes you stay in because it's just you've got really good leaders. But to hear our leaders say the force is strained is alarming to me. They talk about readiness in the context of we've ridden the ships hard, we've ridden the systems hard, They are in need of repair or replacement. The ability to bring the force back up to a ready state is now based on a deployment schedule. We've been there before. That's not a good place to be. We'll get you ready just before you're ready to go, give you everything you've got. When we did, right after 9/11, the question was asked, and I happened to be in the Pentagon at the time working in the OPNAV staff, how many carriers can I get today, and how many carriers can I get in 30 days, and how many carriers can I get in 60 days, and how many carriers can I get in 90 days? The universal thought was, well, this is a problem of maintenance. It didn't turn out to be a maintenance problem. It turned out to be a question of all things, center barrels on F-18s. We didn't have enough F-18s that we could actually load up all the carriers all the time, so it turned out to be a whole different problem. So if you look at that today, 50%, if I've got the numbers right, forgive me, don't try to quote me, but the last I'd heard, 50% of the F-18 flight inventory is in non-reporting status, which means we don't fly it in combat missions. A fair amount, and it might be more than that, there's a fair amount of ships, aircraft, not ready to go. So what happens if you can't train on your systems until the day you're ready to go? It really, really impacts your ability to respond to the combatant commanders who always ask for more than we can provide. Even if we had all the forces fully trained and ready to go, the demand signal's there for an incredible amount of force and presence. It's what the Navy and the Coast Guard and the Marines provide. You're there right now when you need me. We don't have to deploy over to go. You're there. So to be there, you have to have trained forces forward. That, everything I've heard from the Department of the Navy, Marines, sailors, doesn't matter, is we are on the critical edge of not being able to respond and provide additional forces. The immediate set, got them, they're going to go. But the next set of forces, it's really on the edge. And I got to believe they know what they're talking about.
As moderator, I normally don't, participate in the questions, but I do believe I'm the only one at the table that actually did a Vietnam deployment.
No.
Okay.
120 days in combat.
Standardizing 8-month deployments, to me, is scary. And I look at what happened to morale and the state of our maintenance in that era and post-era, where we rationalized the 8-month deployment, scares the heck out of me.
In terms of the Coast Guard, I don't think I want to use the word breaking point, but we have a capacity problem. And just to put in perspective, the Coast Guard boarding officers interdict more illicit drugs every year than the rest of law enforcement put together. That's a huge amount. And the reason is because one cutter in one afternoon will get a 4,000-pound load off the coast of Colombia. If we don't get it at sea, it gets broken up into 10-pound loads, and it comes across the U.S. land borders through containers or what have you. It's a lot harder to get once it gets broken up. So we've got the advantage underway at sea in getting the full loads. That said, our intel is much better now, where we know 90% of the drug flow that comes. The problem is we can only react to about 20% of it. So 70% of that known flow comes through, and all we can do really is wave and go, okay, we know that just went. We didn't do anything about it. We reacted at 20%, and we have a very high interdiction rate. When we have an asset there we can react to, we have about a 90% success rate on those interdictions. But the problem is you don't have the capacity to react to that other 70% that's flowing through that is flowing. That's a capacity problem. All that drugs, it ends up on the streets of America. It causes all other kind of problems. And so what we're saying is this is a good investment. You need to invest in that capacity to have that capability offshore the source countries and get it before it gets broken up. But that's kind of where we're at right now.
Sometimes I think, and Joe, your comments struck me on this. The readiness part, people are the nation tends to think, well, we'll fix that. We'll go when it's time to go. The bathtub is horrible when you come out of it. And what Joe and I lived through in terms of ships that couldn't get underway, in the Pier 1 out of 5 able to get underway and train, that part, rebuilding the force afterward, is just a horrible Navy to be in. It's a horrible place to be when you can't train, you can't do anything, and that just drives people's morale down, and you spend years building that back up. So I don't think the nation gets the readiness problem. They think, well, we're going to go. They don't get the part that it just kills the whole force and the whole enthusiasm and the structure for years afterwards if you do that. for years.
I think there was a comment yesterday, Secretary Stackley said he wants to extend the life of the flight, of the DG-51 Flight 2As, yet they're deploying them longer and their maintenance period is shorter, so you're really burning the candle at both ends. I just don't see from a ship design point of view, we didn't design the ship to do that up front, and you don't have time to put the modernization. We even heard yesterday, I think modernization is being cut back. And we know that the cruisers have issues with their deck house aluminum. So it's a, engineering is engineering. You can't change the law of physics. So if you're going to use a product more, if you drive your car more, you're going to be driving it less years. So it is a major problem to the Navy.
Yeah, I just follow up is that, this phenomenon, I think everybody intrinsically understands how it goes. Like Rick said, if you run it harder, there's going to be a bill to pay. And it's not just the hardware, it's the people as well that come into conflicts. One of the challenges that, this is years ago, the Coast Guard was faced with a bunch of deployments down south for huge mass migration and a bunch of other things, and it had really stressed the fleet. Again, there's always way more mission than there is platforms. That's a given, I think, in all the services. And one of the challenges is that lack of readiness was manifesting itself in ships that were breaking, that couldn't finish a deployment, that had to pull in somewhere and have major work done, and all of those were negative consequences to the operational commander in the sense of getting the fleet done. In fact, in the early 90s, it was of a fleet of about 30-some ships, it was 300 days of lost time due to unexpected casualties. And that literally, for the Coast Guard fleet, that's 2 ships. Well, in partnership between the maintainers and the operators, they did a study called a mission maintenance mismatch. In other words, presupposing that was mismatched, by getting together and laying out those maintenance requirements, and then both sides respecting the other in the sense of the requirements to do mission, but also the operators respecting the requirements to do maintenance. They moved that number from 300 lost days down to, I think it was 13 in just 2 years. You can make a real difference when you have the folks around the table. And what that also did is it allowed us to put contracts in place with the industrial base to do the things so they could plan and they weren't surprised by emergencies and other things, and that made for a much more cost-effective way to manage the ships, plus again it provided additional operational capability. So the models are out there, and I think the impacts of overloading the system and trying to squeeze that thing out, and then if you add 2 or 3 decades to the age of a ship, it even gets harder.
Next government question.
I'm going to go, this is a variation of one of the other questions, and I'll take a little license like Tony did. Without being too parochial, do you think the government always makes the right award decision for a contract? And within the current system, what do you think the government should do to ensure that the best decision is made for the nation, for the government agency, and obviously the taxpayer? And I'm thinking about things like transparency, clarity of specification. Does government really understand what industry does in the sense of providing certain capabilities? And is it spelled out in a way that allows industry to do its best work for us?
Don't hold back.
So I would say they do make the right decision whenever we get the award. But, seriously, I think the government is actually doing a fairly effective job at defining evaluation criteria for awards, and win or lose, debriefing the competitors as to the rationale for the decision. We've been on both sides, on the winning side and the losing side, and it's never fun to be on the losing side. But as I mentioned earlier, we've never filed a formal protest for a large government contract. Really, it's because there was probably something wrong with our proposal that fell short of what the winning competitor did, just to be straight. Can it do better? sure, award us more contracts. But, you know, I think the sincerity and the effort put in by the government to define the criteria and to do a fairly objective selection process is good. I think it's a whole lot different than when we try to offer the same systems in the commercial shipbuilding world, where it's a very opaque system and the rationale for choosing a supplier isn't always nearly as obvious as with our government customer.
If I can add one comment too, I think the level of importance that the government has taken in overlooking and overseeing rather the whole industrial base and making sure, you know, everybody out there prospers and the things like the block buys and stuff is really, really what has helped us along the way. But you know, I agree. I think the government really does do a good job, and you know, we'd all like to win more contracts, but you know, it's up to us to win them. And but like I said, I just think the looking out at the industrial base more and more, which the government is doing to make sure we're keeping healthy and we're able to keep supplying our equipment to the military is, I have to say, greatly appreciated by all of us, and I'm glad to hear that it's happening.
I have only one criticism, and that would be the reverse auction bids. It makes the company feel as if we're making pencils, and I guarantee you, if you come and see our facility, we have a lot more invested in our operations than it takes to make something quite so simple, and that really makes you wonder about the long-term investments you've made when anyone can bid on it and you don't know the tenure of the company you're bidding against, and they don't know what they're getting their arms around. So, but generally speaking, those are very infrequent. We haven't had many, and I think the process is quite fair otherwise.
And no, I'll echo the same results as my colleagues here. I think the government does the best they can with a very difficult situation. The industrial base is shrinking, and once it's gone, that's the worst thing that can happen. So the government does a good job of trying to keep everybody interested and keep everybody in the game.
I would compliment you. It's important for you to tell us and tell Congress too, so that they know when we've lost or about to lose an important part of the base. So it's a two-part part here. If you need to speak up and keep doing that, please.
I think we have time for one more question, and it's industries.
I'd like to ask a question.
Okay.
So today we've been talking about all the obstacles that government puts out and you know, what the government can do better. You've heard some of the things that we've said, but I'd like to hear if there's any more ideas on what the industry base and the suppliers can do better in support of the things that you guys need.
Well, I'll take a crack at it. What the heck? This is, if it was in my perfect world, in my absolutely perfect world, when I was a program manager, I wouldn't have 16 people coming in trying to tell me they're the best source for the one single product I've got. I have one or two. Because I don't know which of the 16 is there, but everybody telling me that they're the best, which I understand now that I'm on the other side of the fence. I get that. But it just drives you crazy.
That's a good point.
You know, and I don't know that I know there's no solution to that because every company needs to bring their best foot forward and present to us. But it does complicate the problem in some ways. Everyone will do exactly everything they can to get themselves the contract and get themselves the win, be the supplier. That's the economic system we live in, and I wouldn't change that for the world. On the other hand, it sure makes it hard to be in government because we create processes to make sure out of those 16 wonderful suppliers, we know kid and pick the best one, and that drives an awful lot of process, a lot of writing specs tight. It drives us to a whole bunch of processes and procedures because every one of the 16 has an equal share to win, and we know somebody's going to say, why not me at the end of the day, and we need to be able to show why. So I'm not asking for the perfect world. We won't get it. I like the system we live in. I defended that system, but it certainly makes it a little more challenging. If there was some process to inside of industry, and there are some places where the best of breeds start to shine, and you can kind of know who they are because the industry self-grades. That's a helpful thing. Maybe some more of that, a little hard.
And my observation is with industry, and I was in Navy a long time, but been with industry as well, but there's two areas that could go a little bit better. And us as a community together, people in this room, and us as industry and government, we get wrapped up really tight in these cones of silence and NDAs, and we don't talk to each other. And it gets kind of ridiculous, like we don't trust anyone at any time. And we've got to increase trust between us. I think that's a big one. And also industry, you think the government's the only one slow in making decisions? I know some big corporations also extremely slow in getting a proposal out the door. It really hurts actually the divisions because they can't get approvals to do things fast and can't respond quickly. So bureaucracy gets in the way, I think.
Good point.
Yeah, there's another part to that. I've noticed now that we on the government side, and I'll put myself back in uniform, it's gotten much worse in terms of being able to talk to government in the process, and I think it gets worse because there's this, how can you be ironclad against either the enthusiasm of a protest or just the appearance of something in the newspaper. So the government side tends to clam up a little sooner than we used to. I think that has something to do with the confidence in dealing with industry, a young acquisition workforce, young contracting officers. I'd like to see personally that sort of open up. I think it'll take a while. It just builds, people need to get comfortable in their shoes, in their business, in the comfort of working with industry. And maybe you can help with that. It's just helping people understand on the government side that it is a collaboration of interests that make it work. And climbing up sooner really makes it hard.
Yeah, just recognizing why we're all here. What a great opportunity to have conversations without lawyers and a whole gang of folks in the space with you, is to have these discussions here. We all know what the rules are, but sometimes we get so wrapped up, and I like your terms of the cones of silence, but in this environment, as professionals in the business of supporting the fleet and the men and women that sail the ships and all the other systems that provide the support and defend our nation, these kind of events, these conferences, this type of venue is a great place to have those conversations that you just can't have inside either a government or a corporate headquarters. This is how to do it. This is the value proposition, and I would tell you that there's an obligation for all of us to go back and talk about the candid, frank conversations, the sidebars that are occurring all over the place in between these sessions that are so useful to both industry and to government.
Well, let's give our panelists a hand. Thank you all very much for some great dialogue. I hope you all enjoyed it. I always enjoy being the only adult supervision. So thank you all. There will be a gift, a donation to Wounded Warrior in the names of all the panelists. Thank you very much. Before we all break, I believe that Tony, you have some announcements to make.
Administrative announcements. The Admiral Tai is not able to make it with us, so the cyber panel will not occur. In its place, Tony, the Modeling and Simulation Group is going to have a roundtable in Potomac 6. When we reconvene after lunch, I think it's after lunch at 1300, in this room will be the Future Programs panel, and the Women in Naval Engineering panel will still occur as planned. So there's still an afternoon program in place. You're not going anyplace anyway outside, so stick around and enjoy. Thanks very much. Oh, yeah, lunch is directly outside.
Yeah, and I was going to say for the MMA members, lunch is outside, and then we will meet back in the Potomac at 1:30. I'll give everybody an hour for lunch, and we'll see you back in the Potomac 2 and 4 at 1:30. Thank you.